The summer expedition was supposed to be a straightforward research mission, the kind of fieldwork where long days of collecting data ended with tired smiles and campfire stories. The team had mapped hundreds of caves before, but this one was different. The locals called it the Maw. Nestled deep in the Appalachian woods, the cave was notorious, shrouded in local legends of eerie noises and vanishing explorers. Most of those stories were written off as superstition, tales designed to keep children away from danger. But the researchers were here for science, and no myth was going to stop them. The team consisted of 4 seasoned spelunkers: Dr. Robert Anders, a geologist, and the leader, Camilla Diaz, a hydrologist known for her curiosity and fearless attitude. Ian, the team's cartographer who often relied on humor to diffuse tension, and Daniel Carter, the youngest member, an eager cave ecologist always ready to prove himself. They had descended into the cave early in the morning, their headlamps painting the walls in stark, dancing light, their voices echoing off the limestone. The descent was thrilling. They had ventured deeper than any local had claimed to go. The caverns twisted and turned, their paths often narrowing to tight squeezes, then opening into vast, echoing chambers. Camilla was the first to notice the strange formations on the walls, jagged, almost like teeth. She joked that it looked like they were being swallowed whole, a sentiment that earned a nervous chuckle from Ian. It was late afternoon when it happened. They had come across a particularly narrow passageway, one that Robert insisted on exploring. He had a hunch. His instincts as a geologist told him there was something beyond, something worth discovering. Daniel, always eager, volunteered to go first. He slipped through the tight gap, his body disappearing from sight while his voice carried back faint updates. "It opens up! There's a chamber here!" Daniel's voice echoed back, laced with excitement. "I think there's a..." The sound of crumbling rock interrupted him, followed by a gut-wrenching scream that cut through the darkness. Ian rushed forward, his heart pounding in his ears as he yelled Daniel's name. Camilla scrambled to set up a light, illuminating the jagged edges of the narrow passage. Robert's voice was steady, commanding everyone to stay calm, but the quiver in his voice betrayed his fear. "Daniel!" Ian called again, his voice echoing uselessly into the dark. There was no response, only the distant sound of rocks tumbling, fading into a hollow silence that seemed to swallow everything. Robert managed to squeeze through the passage, with Camilla right behind. They found themselves in a small chamber, but Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was a gaping hole in the ground, a sinkhole that seemed to stretch into endless black. The edges were fresh, unstable, crumbling slightly under Robert's weight as he approached. "He must have fallen," Robert muttered, his voice barely audible. He knelt near the edge, shining his light into the void. The beam was swallowed by the darkness, never reaching the bottom. Camilla felt her stomach twist as she looked down, a chill spreading through her body despite the stifling heat of the cave. Hours passed in a frantic blur. They called for Daniel until their voices were hoarse, the echoes mocking them with hollow repetitions. They tried to contact the surface, radioing for help, and soon, a rescue team was mobilized. The hours stretched into an agonizing wait, punctuated by the occasional crumble of rock that reminded them of how unstable the ground was. When the rescue team finally arrived, their assessment was grim. The sinkhole was too unstable, the walls of the cave threatening to collapse at any moment. Any attempt to retrieve Daniel could trigger a complete collapse, burying them all. Robert argued, pleaded even, his voice cracking under the strain, but the rescue leader shook his head. It was too dangerous.
They had to leave him.
The hike back to the surface was unbearable. Ian, usually the one to crack jokes and lighten the mood, was silent, his eyes empty. Camilla kept her head down, her mind replaying Daniel's last words, that hint of excitement, before it was replaced by terror. Robert led the way, his face set in a grim mask, but the others could see the weight in his shoulders, the way he hesitated at every turn, as if expecting Daniel to appear. grinning and unscathed. Days later, they held a memorial for Daniel at the edge of the forest, overlooking the cave entrance. The locals gathered, murmuring prayers and lighting candles. Camilla stood apart from the group, her eyes fixed on the dark opening of the maw. She could still hear the whistle of the wind through the cave, the hollow echo that seemed almost alive. Robert never forgave himself. He left the research field entirely, retreating into solitude. Ian, on the other hand, became obsessed. He returned to the cave, alone, despite the warnings, despite Camilla's desperate pleas. He was convinced there was more to it, that Daniel might still be down there, waiting. He spoke of hearing things, faint whispers, echoes that didn't belong. Camilla tried to move on, to forget, but the nightmares wouldn't let her. In her dreams, she was back in that chamber, staring into the sinkhole. But instead of darkness, she saw Daniel, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth moving silently, as if trying to tell her something. She always woke up before she could understand. Months later, Ian disappeared. He had told no one of his plans, but Camilla knew. She knew he had gone back, that the whispers had called him, just as they called to her sometimes in the dead of night. She stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the dark, the wind carrying faint echoes from the cave. A whistle, a voice, a plea. The locals spoke of the maw with renewed fear, the stories of the vanishing explorers growing darker. Some claimed the cave was hungry, that it demanded a sacrifice now and then. Others whispered that the cave wasn't just a cave, that something lived deep within, something that lured people in, only to swallow them whole. Camilla never returned, but she knew she would never truly escape it. The maw had taken Daniel and now Ian, and it waited, patient and silent. In the quiet moments when the world was still, she could almost hear it, a distant whistle echoing through the dark, calling her name. Story 2. The air felt damp and thick as the four cavers climbed down the narrow opening. They moved deliberately, their gear clinking softly against the jagged limestone walls. No one spoke. The echo of their footfalls and the rhythmic breathing through their masks filled the cavern. In moments like these, silence wasn't a burden. It was the price they paid to feel alive, descending into the earth to places unknown, far from the world that spun above them. There was Joe, the informal leader, an expert on caves, never hesitant, always up for a challenge. He held the belief that the earth had secrets worth discovering, even if some of them fought back. Following close was Marcy, Joe's longtime friend, with a knack for sensing direction even when the narrow passages twisted in every possible way. Behind her were Pete and Lucas, the inseparable duo, bound by a shared obsession for adrenaline, all of them veterans of numerous cave expeditions. They trusted their skills and maybe a bit too much each other. They had heard about the recent cave-ins, warnings echoing from fellow cavers, caution from even the park authorities. But for Joe and his group, those warnings might as well have been dares. They weren't new to this. They knew the risks, or so they thought. The map Joe held wasn't official. It had been scribbled on a bar napkin by a caver who said he'd barely escaped. That was the thrill, going where others hesitated. Hours passed. The air became cooler as they delved deeper, the light from their headlamps casting long, flickering shadows along the tunnel walls. The cave's veins narrowed, passages twisting in chaotic, deceptive ways. Some were barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, requiring them to wiggle, inch by inch, their backs scraping against damp rock. They didn't speak much, conserving energy, but Marcy occasionally muttered that something felt off. An unease that settled in her stomach, heavy like a stone. When they reached a point Joe called the crossroads, a fork where the cave split in three, he paused, frowning at the crumpled map. He squinted in the dim light, turning it as if that might make sense of the scribbles. Pete looked over his shoulder, impatience clear on his face. "Which way, Joe?" Joe hesitated, the only sound their breathing, amplified in the hollow space. Marcy looked over at Lucas, who shrugged with a nervous smile. He was usually the group's joker, but he'd been quiet since they entered the cave, his usual quips swallowed by the pressing weight of the earth above them. Finally, Joe nodded. "This way," he said, pointing to the narrowest of the 3 passages. It was a tight fit, even for Marcy, the smallest of the group. They took turns wiggling through, the rocks pressing against their chests and backs like the cave was trying to squeeze them out. By the time they cleared the narrow tunnel and entered a larger chamber, everyone was visibly strained. Pete cursed under his breath, rubbing a bruise on his arm from where the rocks had scraped him. "Man, this place better be worth it." Joe flashed a grin, though it lacked its usual confidence. "It will be. No one's been this far in years." Lucas looked around, his lamp illuminating the jagged ceiling. "No one except the guy who gave you that map, right?" There was a hint of skepticism in his voice. Marcy sighed, setting her pack down. "Let's just take a breather. We've been at this for hours." They all sat, their breaths echoing slightly. The chamber was cold, the air stale. It was then that Marcy realized what was bothering her. The air felt wrong. Not just cold, thin. It felt like it was running out. "Hey, Joe," she called, her voice tight. "Did the map mention anything about ventilation here?" Joe frowned, looking up. "Ventilation? No. It didn't say anything." "Why?" Marcy swallowed, her throat dry. "It's just..." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It feels like the air's not moving, like there's nothing left." Lucas looked around, suddenly feeling the same pressure in his chest. He tried to inhale deeply but found the breath shallow, unsatisfying. "She's right. It's not just cold." Joe looked uneasy for the first time. He stood, taking a few steps towards the entrance they'd come through. He paused, listening. There was nothing. No rustling, no whisper of wind, nothing. "We should move," he said, his voice low, the gravity of their situation starting to dawn on him. They moved quickly, packing up and heading back to the narrow passage. Pete led the way, wriggling back through the tight space. But as they inched forward, a deep, low rumble reverberated through the stone. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The sound of something shifting, something giving way. "Move!" Joe shouted, panic cracking his voice. The rumble grew louder, the rocks around them groaning under unseen pressure. Dust and small pebbles began to fall from above, and Pete started to panic, his movements frantic as he tried to push himself through the constricting passage. Marcy was behind him, shouting encouragement, her own fear rising like bile in her throat. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash. The ceiling of the narrow passage gave way, rocks collapsing between Pete and the others. Marcy screamed, her voice swallowed by the chaos. Joe and Lucas scrambled back, their lights flickering as dust choked the air, the passage sealing itself off with a final echoing thud. Silence followed, a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcy's lamp was still on, her face pale as she stared at the wall of rock that now separated them from Pete. She turned to Joe, her eyes wide, panic-stricken. "What do we do? Joe, what do we do?" Joe didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the collapsed passage, his mind racing. They were trapped. There was no way out. The air was already thin. And now they were cut off from the only path they knew. Lucas slumped against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. We have to conserve oxygen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We can't panic." Joe nodded, though his hands were trembling. We'll figure something out," he said, though even he didn't believe it. Hours passed. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, their lamps dimming as the batteries drained. The air was growing thinner, each breath more labored than the last. Marcy had stopped talking, her eyes closed as she leaned against the wall, her breath shallow. Lucas was lying on the ground, his chest rising and falling in quick, desperate movements. Joe sat in the middle of the chamber, staring at the map in his hands. The lines were meaningless now, just ink on paper. He had led them here. He had ignored the warnings, trusted a scribbled map over common sense. And now they were going to die here, in the dark, where no one would find them. Days later, when the rescue team finally reached them, the air in the chamber was gone, replaced by the heavy, still weight of death. They found Joe, Marcy, and Lucas huddled together, their lamps long since dead. The map clutched in Joe's cold, stiff fingers. The cave had kept its secret, after all.